For years, I thought the season was ending because the weather was changing, but later I realized I was the one ending it with my own hands. Every August, I watch my tomato plants slow down and I blame the heat, the cool nights, or simple bad luck. I accepted smaller harvests because everyone around me said that was just how tomatoes worked. Then one old neighbor smiled at me and said, "You are feeding the plant like it is still spring and expecting it to behave like summer will never end." That sentence stayed with me for years because it changed the way I looked at every tomato bush in my garden. I want to share that with you today because if your plants still have green leaves and healthy roots, there is a very good chance they can keep giving you tomatoes much longer than you expect. I have been growing tomatoes for many years and I have made almost every mistake a person can make. I watered too much when the days were hot. I left too many branches because I felt sorry to cut them. I waited for nature to fix problems that only I could solve. Every one of those mistakes quietly stole fruit from me without me noticing. Most people believe that once August arrives, the harvest naturally becomes weaker, but that is only part of the story. What really happens is that the plant spends its strength in the wrong places while we continue taking care of it, the same way we did earlier in the season. That is where the biggest loss begins, and very few gardeners notice it. I learned many years ago that the second half of summer needs a different approach, and it does not require expensive products or difficult methods. In fact, one of the most useful tricks I still use today costs almost nothing and takes only a few minutes. Hardly anyone around me was doing it back then, and even now, many people skip it completely. In the next part, I will tell you about the first simple change that helped me keep fresh tomatoes growing when many other gardens were already slowing down. I remember the first time I actually followed that old advice instead of doing things my own way. It was one of those warm August mornings when the garden looked healthy from a distance, but something felt different when I walked between the rows. The leaves were still green, yet the plants seemed tired and the new flowers were smaller than before. Most people would simply water a little more and hope for the best. I used to do exactly the same thing, and every year I wondered why the harvest slowly disappeared. Then I changed one simple habit and everything started to look different. The first thing I do in the second half of summer is stop letting the tomato plant waste its strength. Many people leave every new shoot because they think more branches mean more tomatoes. But in reality, the plant spends precious energy feeding leaves that will never give you a good harvest before the cold weather arrives. An older gardener showed me this many years ago and said, "Do not be afraid to help the plant choose what matters." Since then, I carefully remove the weak side shoots and any small growth that appears too late to become strong. I do not rush and I never remove too much at once because that only creates stress. I simply spend a few quiet minutes with each plant and look at it carefully. You would be surprised how much lighter and healthier the plant looks after that. Another mistake most people make happens right here. They continue watering exactly as they did in early summer. Hot afternoons tempt us to bring out the watering can every day, but tomatoes do not always need that much water. I prefer watering deeply and then giving the soil time to breathe. The roots grow stronger, and the fruits become firmer instead of watery. This costs nothing and often saves water as well, which is always a good thing. There is one more small trick that very few people around me use. After removing the unnecessary growth, I always take a close look at the first yellowing leaves near the bottom of the plant. If they no longer help the plant and only block fresh air, I remove them little by little. The bushes stay cleaner, the air moves more freely, and after rain, everything dries faster. It is such a simple habit that many people ignore it, but every year it reminds me that small actions repeated at the right time often bring the biggest harvest. But there is another old method that changed my late season tomatoes even more, and most gardeners never think about it because they believe feeding the plants is enough. That is exactly what I want to show you next. There is one lesson I learned much later than I should have, and it probably gave me more extra tomatoes than any fertilizer I have ever bought. For many years, I believed that feeding the plant more often would solve every problem. If the harvest became smaller, I added more fertilizer. If the leaves looked pale, I added something else. I was trying to help, but I was actually making the plant work harder instead of smarter. An experienced gardener looked at my plants one afternoon and quietly asked me one question. "Are you feeding the fruit or are you feeding the leaves?" That question changed the way I cared for tomatoes forever. From the second half of summer, I stopped trying to push fast green growth because that season is already behind us. Now I want the plant to spend its remaining strength on the tomatoes that are already growing and on the flowers that still have enough time to become fruit before the first cold nights arrive. Very few people think about this change, and that is why they often end the season disappointed. Another small habit has become part of my routine, and it costs almost nothing. Every few days, I walk through the garden without carrying any tools. I simply look. I touch the stems, I lift a few leaves, I check whether the fruits are hidden deep inside the bush or getting enough light. Many problems can be noticed early if you spend just a few quiet minutes paying attention. Most gardeners only react after something has already gone wrong, but by then the plant has already lost valuable energy. Many years ago, an elderly neighbor told me that tomatoes speak quietly, and if you wait until they start shouting, it is usually too late. I never forgot those words because they have proven true again and again. I also avoid leaving damaged or cracked fruits on the plant for too long. Some people think they are not hurting anything, but I prefer removing them as soon as I notice them. The plant stays cleaner, and I can immediately enjoy or use those tomatoes before they become a bigger problem. It is another simple habit that takes only moments but keeps everything looking healthy and productive. At this point, many people believe they have done everything necessary, but there is one forgotten old method that becomes especially important when the nights begin getting cooler. I learned it decades ago from a man who always harvested tomatoes long after everyone else had already cleared their gardens. And that simple method is what I want to share with you. Next up, one of the oldest habits I still follow every year is so simple that many people smile when they first hear about it. They think it cannot possibly make a difference. I used to think the same way until I watched my neighbor collecting baskets of ripe tomatoes while most of us had already accepted that the season was almost over. He told me that the second half of summer is not the time to let the plant grow without direction. It is the time to help it finish what it has already started. Those words stayed with me because every season they prove themselves again. When the nights begin to cool down, I carefully look at the top of each tomato plant. If I see flowers that have appeared very late and clearly have no chance of becoming full ripe tomatoes before cold weather arrives, I do not leave them there. At first it felt strange because removing healthy flowers seemed like a mistake. Then I noticed something interesting. Instead of wasting strength on fruit that would never mature, the plant focused on the tomatoes that were already growing. They became larger, they ripened more evenly, and I was picking good fruit while many gardens nearby had almost stopped producing. Hardly anyone talks about this simple step, but it has become one of the most valuable parts of my late summer routine. There is another mistake that many gardeners make at exactly this time. They stop visiting the garden every day because they believe the hard work is already finished. I actually spend a little more time there now than I did earlier in the season. Not because there is more work, but because small changes happen quickly. One morning, everything looks perfect, and 2 days later, a few damaged leaves or overripe fruits begin slowing the whole plant down. I would rather spend 10 peaceful minutes each evening than several hours later trying to solve problems that could have been prevented. It also gives me a chance to harvest ripe tomatoes as soon as they are ready. I never leave them hanging longer than necessary because every ripe fruit still attached asks the plant to keep sending energy there instead of helping the remaining tomatoes develop. This small habit costs nothing, and after many years I have become convinced it is one of the easiest ways to extend the harvest. But there is one final method that ties all these little habits together. It is an old practice that almost disappeared with time, and once I understood why it worked, my tomato season became longer than I had ever imagined. Many people ask me when I finally stopped trying to make the tomato plants grow taller. My answer is always the same. When the second half of summer arrives, I stop thinking about height, and I start thinking about harvest. That small change in thinking made a bigger difference than I expected. For years I watched my plants become large and beautiful, but I was not collecting as many ripe tomatoes as I wanted before the first cold mornings arrived. Then one older gardener smiled and said that a tomato plant does not need endless growth. It needs help finishing its work. I have followed that advice ever since, and I have never regretted it. One habit that I never skip is keeping the soil in good condition instead of constantly trying to fix the plant itself. Most people pay attention only to the leaves and fruits, but they forget what is happening below. I like to keep a light layer of mulch around the base of the plants because it helps the soil hold moisture more evenly and keeps the roots from suffering during hot days followed by cool nights. It is an old method that costs very little if you use what you already have in the garden. I have used dry grass after it has fully dried or other simple natural materials, and they have served me well for many seasons. Very few people think about how much stress the roots experience when the soil becomes too hot during the day and too dry a day later. Reducing that stress often helps the entire plant stay productive longer. There is another small habit that many gardeners overlook. I always pay attention to the weather forecast. If I know several cool nights are coming, I harvest tomatoes that have already reached a good size even if they are not fully red yet. They finish ripening safely indoors and the plant immediately begins sending its strength to the remaining fruit. Years ago, I waited for every tomato to become perfectly ripe on the vine, and many of them never reached that point because the weather changed too quickly. That was a mistake I no longer make. The nice thing is that none of these methods require expensive products or special equipment. They simply require little attention and a few quiet minutes every few days. The garden rewards patience much more often than money. There is still one final lesson I want to share because it brings all these simple habits together and explains why some people are still picking fresh tomatoes when others believe the season has already ended. There is one final habit before the harvest season begins to wind down that I believe ties everything together better than anything else I have learned over the years. It is not a special fertilizer, and it is not an expensive product from a garden center. It is simply paying attention to the plant every single time you visit the garden. Many people only notice the tomatoes themselves, but I have learned to watch the whole plant. I look at the leaves, I look at the stems, I notice whether the flowers still appear healthy, and whether the fruits continue growing at a steady pace. The plant often tells you what it needs long before a serious problem appears. Most people miss those quiet signs because they only look when something has already gone wrong. That is one mistake I try not to repeat anymore. Many years ago, an older man who had been growing tomatoes longer than I had been alive told me that every successful harvest begins with observation and not with work. At first, I did not fully understand what he meant. Later, I realized he was right. If you notice a problem early, the solution is usually simple. If you ignore it for a week, it often becomes much harder to fix. That lesson has helped me not only with tomatoes, but with every crop I grow. Another habit that has served me well is harvesting regularly without waiting for every tomato to become perfectly red. As soon as a fruit has reached a good stage of maturity, I pick it and let it finish ripening in a safe place if necessary. This frees the plant to continue feeding the remaining tomatoes instead of spending unnecessary energy on fruit that is already almost finished. Many gardeners are surprised how much longer the harvest continues after they begin doing this. It costs nothing and only takes a few extra minutes each time you walk through the garden. I also never become discouraged if a few leaves turn yellow or if one plant looks weaker than the others. Every season is different, and every garden teaches us something new. What matters is staying patient and making small improvements instead of searching for one miracle solution. In my experience, there has never been a single secret that guarantees a perfect harvest. It is the combination of many simple habits repeated at the right time that keeps the plants productive. And there is one last thought I always remember when the first cool mornings arrive because it reminds me why some gardeners continue filling baskets with tomatoes, while others believe the season has already come to an end. Now when people ask me why my tomato plants continue giving me fresh fruit, long after many other gardens have slowed down, I never talk about magic tricks or expensive products. I simply tell them that the second half of summer is not the end of the season if you learn to help the plant use its remaining strength wisely. Everything I shared with you today comes from many years of making mistakes and slowly understanding what really matters. I have overwatered plants because I thought they were thirsty when they actually needed air around the roots. I left too many branches because I was afraid of cutting something useful. I waited too long to harvest because I wanted every tomato to become perfectly red on the vine. Every one of those mistakes taught me something valuable, and over time, those lessons became simple habits that I repeat every year without thinking. The best part is that none of these methods require large expenses or complicated equipment. Almost anyone can do them with a little patience and careful attention. That is probably why these old forgotten habits have survived for so many years. They work because they respect the way the plant naturally grows instead of trying to force it. If you begin using even a few of these ideas, you may be surprised to see fresh flowers, healthy fruits, and ripe tomatoes appearing when you expected the season to be ending. There is something deeply satisfying about walking into the garden on a cool morning and filling another basket while many people believe there is nothing left to harvest. That feeling never gets old, no matter how many seasons pass. I still enjoy those quiet moments just as much as I did many years ago when I first discovered these simple methods. Gardening has taught me that patience usually gives a better reward than rushing, and careful observation is often more valuable than buying another product. I hope these ideas help you enjoy a longer harvest and make your work in the garden easier and more rewarding. If you try even one of these old methods this season, I think you will notice the difference for yourself. And next time, I would like to show you another simple technique that has helped me grow stronger, healthier vegetables with less work and almost no extra cost.